They started screaming at 3 in the morning, a sound that snaps through your chest and refuses to be explained away as a dream. I remember it like a bright, nasty light cutting a dark room in half. I remember thinking, for a second, that the house was playing tricks on me. Then the second scream came and everything trained in my blood took over. I was at my daughter's door before my feet hit the floor. Her wheelchair was empty by the window. The screen slashed like someone had pushed a fist through the night. And on the pillow lay a single note. Jagged handwriting. For words that made my world tilt. Rules must be enforced. My name is Ethan Rowe. I used to work cases where timers in little black boxes were the difference between life and a headline. If you tell people you work for the Bureau, they imagine a certain person buttoned up. Steady. All answers. But that night, I was just a dad with his chest on fire. And the first 3 steps I took were the 3 slowest in a life that used to move in carefully measured bursts. This story isn't about one bad night. It's about what happens when a community gives one person too much power. About how petty cruelty grows teeth when it's lawful. And about how love stubborn, messy, unglamorous love can carve a path through wreckage. It's also about the choices that make you a protector or a prisoner. I'll tell you everything I remember. The bits that hurt. The moments that surprised me. The final odd, quiet thing that makes it all feel like more than a news headline. We moved to Cedar Hollow because it was supposed to be quiet. After my wife's accident, I wanted a place that felt small and manageable for Lily's single-level houses. Broad sidewalks for her wheelchair. Neighbors who traded baked goods instead of gossip. Lily was 12 then, with a laugh that seemed too big for the room and a stubborn streak she'd inherited from me. She'd lost the bottom half of her life in a heartbeat and learned how to build a new one every day. I thought I was doing the right thing by moving us to a place with trees and a mailbox that didn't require stairs. That's when Evelyn Crane showed up at our door like a notice slapped across the face of everything we'd been trying to build. Evelyn was the kind of woman who keeps a ledger in her head: violations, fines, social credit. The president of the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association. Mid-60s. Perfect hair. A smile that lived somewhere between pity and victory. She introduced herself with a list: unapproved ramp, grass too long, garbage in the wrong bin. She handed me a clipboard like a judge handing down a sentence. I told her Lily needed the ramp. She told me the covenants were clear. I told her the Fair Housing Act existed. She smiled. And she said, "We'll see what our lawyers say." What followed was 6 months of small, precise cruelty that felt like getting sand in your mouth, irritating. Everywhere. Impossible to ignore. Fines for things that didn't make sense: the width of our mailbox, a bird feeder, the 2-wheel tracks in the driveway that, apparently, upset somebody's idea of aesthetics. Evelyn would show up at meetings and cite bylaws like scripture. Eyes fixed on me in that way you look at a problem you mean to solve. She was eloquent about order. She spoke about community standards while quietly reshaping whose voices were allowed to count. At first, it was a matter of discomfort and awkward apologies from neighbors who didn't want to make waves. Then the whispers started. Little lies about our home, that we kept medical facilities in the garage, that Lily's equipment was unsanitary, that maybe my work meant things I didn't tell them about. Evelyn was careful. She wasn't the kind of person who yelled. She was the kind who turned neighbors into jurors and looked at you with the calm entitlement of someone who'd already counted the votes. You learn a lot about people when they don't have to speak to your face. Some of our neighbors drifted away like the tide. Others smiled wider, as if to make room for Evelyn's view of things. I complained. I documented. I sent emails. I kept every paper Evelyn sent, every fine, every polite-sounding letter. I wasn't naive. I'd worked enough cases to know proof matters. But it's different when the attack feels social. It wraps itself into your mailbox and your PDA meeting and your Tuesday. You start watching your daughter for the small changes. She stops saying certain things. She walks around in circles with questions she won't ask aloud. She started to withdraw, and I started to carry a file folder like a talisman. The night Lily disappeared, we'd had a small sign on the porch, nothing fancy. A cardboard cutout from a campaign Lily liked. Evelyn had written a letter about the sign 2 weeks earlier and called it an eyesore. The letter was in the folder. That night, whoever came through Lily's window left muddy tracks like a promise. They left that note. They left me without my kid. When you don't have all the time in the world, you learn to act fast. I called 911, but I didn't wait on them. We had been through a half-dozen incidents where the local PD treated us like the problem of family causing trouble. A guy who thinks a ramp is a war zone. Evelyn's husband used to be on the force. Her brother sat on the bench. Those relationships were invisible armor. I couldn't afford to wait for the system that had been bending away from me to suddenly straighten up. I grabbed my badge and the phone and a list of people who owed me small favors: analysts. A tech who owed me a beer. Someone who used to work towers and could read pings like a tea leaf. The first miracle of the night was mundane, a cell ping near the old mill road. From a phone registered to Evelyn Crane. 20 minutes before. The second miracle was that my training remembered things I'd thought I'd left at the office, patterns and footprints. The curbside scuffs of a wheelchair. The way a person carries themselves when they mean to hurt and when they mean to teach. The mill road was a place that seemed like a map that had been abandoned in the margins of a county plan. Half-built houses. Derelict models. Dirt and trenches where future lawns would go, an ideal place to hide something you don't expect anyone to look for. I drove down that rutted lane with a flashlight and a heart that wouldn't stop telling me two things: find her, and don't let them see you lose it. I remember stepping out. The beam of my light cutting through the fog and landing on fresh tire tracks leading away from the main road. It's an odd clarity. The moment a fact matches a fear. There was a disturbed mound of earth. A patch that didn't belong, soft. Uneven. Like someone slapped the ground back together with more hope than skill. I dug. At first with my hands, because you do stupid things when you think every second is the difference. After a minute, in the dark, my fingers hit plastic and then the hollow sound of air moving through a small hole. I found a container. Taped and ugly and cruel. I didn't think about the optics. I shot the padlock off with the single round I carried, and then ripped the lid open with fingers that smelled like dirt and adrenaline. Lily was curled inside. Small. Bruised. Shivering. Her face was caked with mud, and something worse, the look of someone who'd been given a lesson about the world and found it terrifying. When I pulled the duct tape from her mouth and her hands free, she vomited sound, and then found my face and leaned into me like all the world could still be held together by a single hug. I heard a car door then. A sound that struck the air like betrayal. Evelyn stepped out from behind a mound of dirt with a shovel in her hand, and that smile of hers, now split by something like triumph. She said, very plainly, they broke the rules. Someone had to remind them. There are words the law expects you to use in moments like that: felonious intent, kidnapping, attempted murder. The words were useful later. In court and in reports and in the thick stack of papers that became the armor we needed from the beginning. But in that moment, my only language was the little syllables we use for the urgent business of keeping someone we love breathing. I put Lily between me and Evelyn, and I said, "You called this a lesson." And Evelyn said, "I called it justice." And then the headlights of the first patrol car cut the night clean. Evelyn was arrested without a fuss. She tried to speak like a woman who'd always been right. But she stumbled under the weight of being overheard. She'd spoken to the officers while we were still in that dirt lot, and her voice, calm and monstrous, carried everything. I was protecting the look of the neighborhood. She told them, people need order. It was like watching a person explain weather patterns as a way of justifying murder. There was no gravity to her logic, but there was a kind of chilling sincerity. At the hospital, Lily swallowed air like she'd forgotten how, and then began the slow, careful work of returning to walking through the rest of her life. The physical injuries were limited bruises. Dehydration. The kind of muscle atrophy you only see when someone has been held still for too long. The deeper stuff: trust. Sleep. The ability to be alone in a room that took longer and was more complicated. We sat in rooms with therapists and lawyers and case agents and talked about what had happened and our safety plans and the counter-arguments to the idea that if you were too comfortable with your vulnerability, you'd invite trouble. We learned that none of this is true. We learned that the people who look for reasons to put you in a box aren't interested in your truth. The court scene was a strange theater. Evelyn's defense tried to shape her acts into a crazy episode. A lapse. Temporary insanity. Her lawyer painted a portrait of stress and responsibility. Of a woman buckling under the nobility of managing the neighborhood's morale. The prosecutor had other pictures, purchase receipts for a storage container. Neighbor testimony about her campaign to ostracize Lily. The notes where she'd cataloged violations in exaggerated detail. The jury didn't take long. 40 minutes of deliberation is quick when the facts are heavy and the lies are thin. She was convicted on multiple counts: kidnapping, child endangerment, attempted murder, and sentenced to decades in a system that measures harm with cold numbers. The HOA dissolved under the weight of lawsuits as other families realized Evelyn had used the association like a private wrecking ball. Neighbors who had let themselves be swayed came forward. The ripple effect hit the local department and the courthouse too. People who turned a blind eye had to answer for how blind. But the legal closure, while crucial, is not the same as healing. Lily's nightmares came in waves. She couldn't sit with her back to a wall for months without looking for someone to stand behind her. Like some reflex of a 12-year-old who'd once been put in a box. I learned how much patience love takes when the clock on trauma keeps running. I learned how to answer the same small questions each night until answers became new rituals instead of rehearsed lies. I learned to celebrate tiny victories: a full hour of sleep, a laughter that wasn't a flinch, the first time she wheeled herself without tapping the walls like a blind person, making sure the house stayed where she expected it to. Lily wanted to do more than survive. There was a fierceness in her that had been part of her before the world tried to minimize her. She wanted to start a support group for kids who had disabilities and had been pushed around by the system or by people who thought power meant silence. The group started with 3 kids in our living room and swelled into something that looked like a small revolution. Kids who had been told to be small found a room to be loud in. They taught each other practical things: how to speak up for themselves at school, how to keep records, but more than anything, they gave each other the steady presence of a person who'd been through it and come out the other side. I get asked sometimes about vengeance, about whether I wanted to do anything that would have been satisfying in a human, petty way. The honest answer is this: for a long time, the only thing that would have felt balanced was something that would have cost me my soul. When you're a person whose job is to uphold the law, vengeance only ever looks good on paper. What looked better, ultimately, was seeing justice do its slow, imperfect work and then watching Lily take whatever bone-deep rage she had and turn it into something that helped other people. That's a different kind of victory, the kind that doesn't settle scores so much as rewire the future. There were odd, quiet things that followed. A letter came from Evelyn 5 years later, neat handwriting. Apologies filed like supplies. She wrote about nightmares and the way she'd convinced herself that rules were the only thing that mattered. In the letter, she called what she did a lesson and then, in the same breath, admitted it was monstrous. I read it twice, then thrice. Sometimes I wanted to tear it up. Sometimes I wanted to burn it. Mostly, I filed it and felt the odd, cold satisfaction of a ledger closed. There's an ugly, human part of me that wanted her to suffer, and a quieter, harder part that knew suffering doesn't erase suffering. I watched Lily read the letter and saw her eyes do the strange thing they do when a child chooses to own her future. They look past the person trying to hold you back and toward the work you will do with your hands. A lot of people, when they hear this story, want a tidy ending. They want to imagine lives reset, just as perfect, in a world in which one bad apple can be pulled without affection. That's not how communities are built. The end of Evelyn's control didn't mean the end of division. Politics moved in. There were debates about who had the right to dictate space and aesthetics, about enforcement and fairness. Some people argued that some rules are necessary, that community standards are how we avoid chaos. They weren't entirely wrong. The problem wasn't the idea of rules, it was who made them and how they were used. We can argue about bylaws all day, but when those bylaws are wielded like a cudgel against a person because they don't fit a neighborhood's image, that's not governance, that's a weapon. If I could go back and tell the audience one thing, it's this: power without accountability always looks like righteousness. You've seen it: someone who cares a lot about keeping a place proper and less about keeping people safe. They will dress their cruelty as concern, their suspicion as stewardship. The countermeasure is boring and slow and human: neighbors who speak up, officers who do their job, institutions that aren't afraid to investigate their own. It's the neighbors who knock on a door with cookies and an apology. It's the officer who remembers that a badge is an obligation, not a favor. It's you, showing up when a voice is being quieted. Lily went to college. She studied social work and advocacy and took a public speaking class that made her a force. She started to speak at school assemblies, at panels, at workshops about disability rights and community accountability. The girl who had once been buried in the dark became someone who could stand under a spotlight and make room for others to tell their truth. There were times I sat in the back of an auditorium and felt like the luckiest man alive and like a relic of some past life at once. She held their attention by telling them the facts and then walking them through what to do with them. Document things. Call it out. Get witnesses. Name the harm. She'd learned how to take furnace-hot anger and temper it into a hammer that can break open systems. People asked whether the community changed after Evelyn Weather Cedar Hollow became something kinder by default. In the beginning, it was cautious. People felt the edges of their own responsibility and stepped back. Then some people stepped forward. There were dinners arranged without an agenda. There were small committees to reconsider bylaws with external oversight. The HOA's dissolution didn't make the problem vanish. It just made it visible. And sometimes seeing the problem is the first step towards fixing it. There's one scene I can't shake, Lily. 2 years later. At the opening of a small memorial garden she'd helped organize for kids who had faced dehumanizing cruelty. She chose a stone with an inscription she wrote herself. You belong. You matter. Your story will be heard. She stood in front of a crowd with a voice that wasn't theatrical, but was steady as a plumb line. And she said, I forgive because I don't want to be hollow. Not for her. For me. I don't want her keeping space in my head anymore. It's an odd kind of mercy. Forgiveness. It doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing not to let your life be managed by the person who tried to break you. That act of refusing to be small, that's what changed our family. The rest. The legal stuff. The reforms. Were necessary. But the real victory was how Lily learned to take her fear and hand it a purpose. If you're watching this and thinking about your own street, your own corner, your own committee meeting, don't wait until something awful happens. Name the small cruelties. They compound. Be curious about governance. Ask who is making the rules and why. Be suspicious of people who measure community by appearance rather than by whether its weakest members are safe. And if you see someone being bullied in the slow, administrative way, fines, whispers, engineering of exclusion, know that silence is permission. I won't pretend this story has one right conclusion. You can argue until the cows come home about property rights and community standards, about where law ends and humanity begins. That's why I want to hear from you. Tell me what you think. Was Evelyn a monster shaped by a rigid world? Or was she the consequence of neighbors who let her take the reins? Was justice enough? Should communities have more tools to protect vulnerable members? Drop a comment. Tell me where you stand. If you've ever been dealing with a petty tyrant, a neighbor, a landlord, an official who confuses power for goodness, share how it felt and what you did. Your voice matters more than you know. If you found this meaningful, share it with somebody who worries about their neighborhood, somebody who's been told to be quiet, somebody who needs to know they aren't alone. Hit the like button if you want more stories that dig into the messy part of community life, the part where the rules meet people and things get complicated. Subscribe if you want to follow Lily's work and see how small acts of courage can change the world in ways no law alone can. I tell stories because they're the way we teach each other how to be human in complicated places. This one began with a scream and a note, and a woman who confused enforcement with virtue. It ends, as most good stories do, with more questions than answers and with the uncomfortable, hopeful knowledge that the people who survive aren't always the ones who win on paper. Sometimes they're the ones who refuse to let hate decide what the world should look like. What would you have done if it was your street? What does true community look like to you? Leave your thoughts below.